How do you do? You know, one of the delightful things about being a broadcaster is that people write letters to you, and I can't tell you how much I enjoy receiving them, especially the ones with stamps on, because the subjects are always so varied. But the one which has stuck out from last week's intake was from an Oxford woman graduate inquiring as to the qualifications needed to be a good broadcaster and here I quote, how does one get into the BBC? Now, of course, there was a dreadful temptation to write back and say, well, personally, I get out at Oxford Circus, walk to Broadcasting House, and then wait to be propelled uncontrollably through the revolving doors. But as to the first part of the inquiry, well, quite honestly, I find it difficult to give a concise answer because the desirable qualifications are legion. For example, a sound knowledge of the alphabet and the ability to spell correctly is a decided asset, and one with which most broadcasters are endowed. On the other hand, in moments of mental aberration, one or two may nod off, as it were, and make statements such as...
Chap called Frank Sully, S for Sammy, U for eunuch. No, that's not right.
And then rushed off to consult his chambers. And then it's easy enough to slip up, isn't it? As indeed a lady announcer did when she advised her Shakespeare-loving listeners that
tonight's presentation is Macbeth, considered by many to be the greatest work of the Bird of Avon.
Which, of course, was the first hint that the poet apparently had spent much of his life in drag, and, moreover, reopened the controversy as to whom our William had dedicated the sonnet beginning, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, and so on. And talking of climatic conditions, never let us forget yet another summer's day when we learned to our astonishment that the outlook would be
staying dry, but with overnight mist and fog.
Which was clear proof that the plague which so sadly had afflicted the Egyptians in the past hadn't yet burned itself out and had spread westward. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, equally astonishing forecasts were being made there.
And the weather in Cyprus. Tonight will start fine.
But will possibly turn windy. And maybe it was the receipt of that somewhat bizarre information in distant Australia which affected the composure of a hitherto unruffled weatherman who, after a confident start, found his isobars in a twist and continued haltingly, saying,
dry northward with mild to warm northwest winds. A preliminary strong wind warning current for south coastal waters. Flood warnings continue for the Lachlan River between Forbes and Condobolin and for the Murray between Yarrawonga and Barham. Sydney's weather today, mild with cloudy periods. You'll have to excuse me. North to northwest winds freshening. The city and Liverpool can expect the top of 19. Currently in the city it's very warm. 16. 7 above normal. Macquarie. News time. 9 minutes past 6.
Now, that understandable but lamentable loss of control could example the need for a strong sense of discipline as an essential in the armoury of the embryonic broadcaster, and indeed that is so. And, if I may, I'll return to that point later. But another indispensable, also made apparent by a speaker from down under, is the ability to communicate facts lucidly and accurately, no matter what the occasion or how hot the news. A particular regrettably overlooked by an eyewitness at a burning tyre factory who, carried away in the heat of the moment, as it were, cried excitedly to his wide-eyed public,
"When I arrived at the scene, flames were leaping out of the factory and it looked as though firemen were fighting a losing battle. The fire in the Firestone tyre factory, a short time ago, the side wall collapsed, exposing hundreds of, or thousands really, of tyres burning in this great blaze out here in Camperdown. Firemen are still trying to put it out, but they're getting things under control now. From the scene here in Camperdown from the scene here in Camperdown at the Firestone Tyre Factory, Warwick Rankin for 2SM.
And then, having left to plunge his head in a cooling bucket of water, later returned to the scene to add more composedly,
"Well, the blaze is still fierce in many places, and as a result of this fire, 2 factories have been gutted and 1 homely left families."
which only goes to show that distant relations of the late Dr. Spooner, who, as you'll recall, was apt to wet his Merd's kickstop from time to time, clearly are alive and flourishing in the outback. And thriving equally well, albeit in North America, are those in whom the spirit of Mrs. Malaprop has entered. And, well, frankly, such people would be well advised to steer clear of microphones, for no one can tell when the ghost of Mrs. M will exert her influence, particularly when the lights are low and the music old and golden, for that's when her victims can be heard to say things like,
Now stay tuned for our Golden Oldies show, featuring your genital host, Gene Taylor.
You see what I mean? And moreover, the phantom of Mrs. Malaprop is no respecter of persons. Even high-ranking Americans have come under her spell, as did the dignitary who, when in the full flood of rhetoric, proclaimed to his audience,
Demonstrations have taken place by workers whose trade union rights have been betrayed, by Catholics whose freedom of expression has been circumscribed, by professional men well, I believe it at least is a Christian right.
Now, agreed he corrected himself, and, because of his charisma, won his audience back. But when, he must have been asking himself, might the fluence strike again? That, as they'd say, was the $64,000 question. And talking of questions, I cannot emphasize too strongly how important it is for potential broadcasters to ask questions in the correct way. And that's not so easy as you might think. You see, if a question's put too directly, it can provoke too direct an answer, which, on the whole, doesn't stimulate conversation. For example,
when do you do your Christmas shopping?
Christmas.
Or,
what do you actually use to build a sandcastle?
And I'm sure you're ahead of me. Conversely, too lengthy and convoluted a question can also cause problems. These often result in the bafflement of the questionee, who, although remaining polite throughout, gives the time-honoured reply, namely,
That's a very good question. I don't know.
Which also brings the proceedings to a grinding halt, so, as you can see, or to be more precise here, the role of a radio interrogator isn't an easy one. And so probably one of the best things one can do, if one's in any doubt as to the outcome of an interview, is to iron out any little anomalies beforehand. As indeed one far-sighted reporter did, asking his intended subject, who was, from the sound of it, a pogo stick champion,
What's the most miles you've done in a year? I can tell you it was 2 years ago you did 6,000...
That's quite correct. And I was going to break the record.
You told me, say, 2 years ago I did. 2 years ago, 6,864.
That's quite correct.
So you say 2 years ago I did?
Yes, I did that. And the last year...
You did what?
I was going to break my record till I had a bad illness.
So how many miles is the record?
That was the record.
What was?
So the 6,000... What was it now?
6,824.
That's right. Yes.
And I'm delighted to tell you that as a result of that meticulous preparation, the final interview was an outstanding success. But, of course, it did require a good deal of time and patience on the part of the interviewer. And that is a virtue which is a must for all broadcasters, and particularly for those concerned with request programmes and who deal directly with members of the public who, well, aren't always quite sure exactly what it is they do want. And it's at such moments, and they do crop up from time to time, that one must learn to curb one's impatience, and instead of saying testily, "Oh, come along now, Mrs. Harbottle, you must have some idea of your choice," one must lean cosily toward the microphone and say encouragingly things like,
Moira Anderson, yes? What's it called?
Where is it? I wrote it down. What was it?
Can't you remember?
I can't remember the blessed thing. I wrote it down somewhere.
Well, will you be satisfied with any Moira Anderson?
Eh?
Will you be satisfied with any Moira Anderson? Because if you can't give me a title, you'll have to be.
Yes, I know I wrote it down somewhere.
Did you?
Anyway, can you play the Phantom Brigade? That's another one. I don't know who that's by.
Oh, yes, really, we like to have the Phantom Brigade.
Eh?
What?
What do you say?
The Phantom Brigade?
Yes.
But not by Moira Anderson.
No, that's by a band.
Is it?
Yes.
Well, if
It's a band that starts a long way away and it gradually gets nearer and then it fades in the distance.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Wait a minute, are you sure it's called the Phantom Brigade? Or is it called the Phantom Regiment?
It might be, I don't know. It starts in the distance and it gradually comes nearer and then it goes away.
Well, I must say I was hugely impressed by the kindness and help afforded to that lady. I mean, everything was done to ease her from her uncertainty and doubt, wasn't it? But then that is the hallmark of the good broadcaster. Always he or she ensures that their listening public are never in doubt about anything. A devotion admirably illustrated by a lady announcer in Cyprus who, having taken a brisk look round the streets of Nicosia, advised all and sundry...
There are quite a few stray cats about, so pet owners are strongly advised to put a collar on their cat, or their dog for that matter, so that the authorities know the difference.
Yeah, and I'm certain that the Cypriot authorities will always be grateful to her. Now, earlier on I mentioned that I had returned to the greatest of all the qualities required by a broadcaster, and I do so now: discipline, on the air. Fortunately, and thanks in no small measure to the late Lord Reith, who I'm sure is listening in now, BBC broadcasters do control their emotions. Sadly, the same cannot be said of some of our transatlantic cousins, and nowhere has this lack of restraint been exampled more blatantly than in this following recording.
Diet or Die. Author, Mrs. Celesta Geyer, perhaps better known to millions of carnival fans as the one-time Dolly Dimples. Remember, the world's most beautiful fat lady? That was the billing Mrs. Geyer used when she weighed 555 pounds. Count 'em, 555 pounds. Now a svelte 122. She tells in her book how she did it, following the advice of a doctor who told her after a near-fatal heart attack to diet or die. The secret of effective weight loss, massive willpower, says Mrs. Geyer, adding that her own willpower was strengthened by the memory. Well, anyhow, she said that her fat friends from carnival life died at an early age, later buried from the back of a truck. Those are her own words. Why truck? Because, said Mrs. Geyer, they were too big for a hearse. Oh, gosh. Oh.
Makes you glad to be British, doesn't it? Anyway, if you have been, thanks for listening. Goodbye.